accidents, and how we ensure that the people of this city can move through and around this city. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Councilmember Rasmussen. We're then going to hear from the departments of the police department, the Department of Transportation, which press conference meeting. Annette Sandberg will also be available. We'll make statements, and then we're going to take a look at the Councilmember.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mayor Murray. One of the key recommendations in the report is that there has to be a sense of urgency and a commitment for improvement from the top. And you can see, because of the people who are here, there is that sense of urgency and the commitment from the top. I chair the Transportation Committee of the City Council. Mayor Murray, of course, our police chief and the head of the Department of Transportation. And I'm stating that this is an urgent matter. I believe that traffic congestion and gridlock that we're experiencing is one of the primary reasons why we're getting objections to some proposals to upzone some parts of our city. People know that it's irresponsible to increase density in our neighborhoods when people are already caught in gridlock nearly every day, even when they take the bus. So just during the last 12 hours, we've had two major incidents during rush hour. One last night in the Battery Street Tunnel, and the other on 4th Avenue, affecting all eastbound traffic from West Seattle. We have to do better in our response to these incidents, and that is not a new priority for the City Council. Last year, in our letter of expectation to the Department of Transportation Director, we made it clear that this is a priority issue. We stated that we expect him to work with the police chief to effectively respond to these emergencies. A year later, the consultant's report shows that there's still much more to do. I'm not content to wait until January, and I think that that's one of the PowerPoints that we have says that we're going to wait till January before we see improvements. I don't think the public wants us to wait another 6 months. We want to see improvements now. As chair of the Transportation Committee, I'm working to get as many of these recommendations implemented as soon as possible. Two things that I can do as a legislator, as a City Council, is to sponsor two pieces of legislation that have been recommended by the consultants. One is a hold harmless ordinance, and the other is a steer it and clear it ordinance. That may be one reason why officers have been reluctant to have cars towed, because we don't have the hold harmless ordinance in place in Seattle, nor the steer it clear it requirement as well. Then, on August 13th, the Transportation Committee will be holding a briefing on the recommendations, because I don't think that my colleagues on the council have been able to get into depth on these. And at that time, what I expect is a plan and deadline for some of these easy and early implementable, easy remedies, early remedies that they may be able to take that are on this list. And also, I want to have a report from SDOT and the police department on their efforts to enforce the box ordinance. We prohibit people from driving into intersections and getting caught there. And what I've been emphasizing is that SDOT and SPD work together to enforce that ordinance. And we're beginning to see progress, but we want to see more progress and find out if there are barriers or what those barriers are to enforcing the box ordinance. In September, I'll be rolling out a comprehensive list of near-term recommendations and actions that the Department of Transportation and the Seattle Police Department can take in the West Seattle Transportation Corridor. I requested that an interdepartmental team be created, and it started work early this year. We have a long list, a robust list of improvements that can be made just by managing traffic in this corridor, and we can begin to implement those this fall. So I thank Mayor Murray for taking this issue very seriously, and to the leadership of the Police Department and the Department of Transportation for looking at how they can work together to improve our response to the transportation of the traffic incidents that we experience nearly weekly. So thank you very much.
Thank you. My name is Annette Sandberg, and I am the principal of TransSafe Consulting and was one of the consultants on this project. And I'm presenting on behalf of both myself and Sam Schwartz Engineering and the results that we have with regard to this project once we get the PowerPoint going. Just by way of background, though, we can go ahead and start once that happens. Really, the background of this project was as a result, as the mayor said, from the incident that occurred this spring. And out of that, we both organizations, Sam Swartz Engineering and TransSafe Consulting, were engaged to do a couple of things. The first was to look at traffic incident management in general. Both of us have expertise as it relates to traffic incident management, and within that context, review the current practices and policies that the city has in place or had in place in the spring, and then make recommendations moving forward on ways that they could improve those practices and policies. So,
Rick, why don't you just, can you click through with the keypad?
Can you get it to move through? Heather?
up. So go ahead and move forward a couple.
Okay.
Go ahead. So just go back to that slide right there. One of the things that we wanted to take into consideration, not every city is created equal, and having been a trooper here in Seattle, I know that for a fact. Seattle is very unique in its design and layout, and we used this graphic to, when the experts that we brought in, to actually make them understand the unique challenges that Seattle has because of its hourglass shape. And everything happens to come down to the narrowest point right in the center of the city. And so because of that, that requires some very specific recommendations for the city, for both the Department of Transportation and the Police Department on ways to try to mitigate traffic blockages that might happen in that area. So as I was mentioning, the project elements were to look at traffic incident management. We refer to that as TIM. And in our review, actually look at the current collision response practices and policies, both of the DOT, SPD, and others. We actually conducted a workshop with nationally recognized experts from all over the country, from other cities, other jurisdictions. They were made up of police officials, traffic officials, Department of Transportation officials, Federal Highways was involved, and some state officials as well. And we wanted those experts to really provide a broader base of recommendations and look so that it was more than just a couple of eyes looking at this project. So we were very fortunate to have those people come in and participate in this project, and they helped shape the recommendations. And then out of that, the draft recommendations report, which I'm going to cover today. I won't go through the key findings because the mayor hit those very well. There clearly were some deficiencies in the existing practices and procedures for the city. However, there's one thing I really want to mention, and that's that from the time that the incident happened that triggered this entire study and review, one of the things that the expert panel as well as the two consultant groups were very impressed with was the actions that had already been taken by the police department and the DOT to jumpstart activities to correct some of these problems. So it's not like they were standing by waiting for somebody to come in and say this is what needs to be done. There were a number of activities that they had already started as it related to training, coordination, and working together to try to resolve some of these traffic incident problems downstream. So with that, I want to just walk through the recommendations and make sure that we have enough time for questions at the end. So first, the first was to create a culture of traffic incident management. And as the mayor mentioned, and I think it was probably the most critical thing, is to really prioritize traffic over property. That's what TIM is all about. It's what federal highways and state DOTs really focus on, is that oftentimes there's additional accidents that happen behind an initial incident, and those additional accidents actually cause more injuries, more damage, and more backup. So you have to prioritize traffic over property. And that really comes from a tone at the top, and that's what this recommendation is about. The next is to create a citywide traffic incident management program. And this really starts with a couple of things. The first is a memorandum of understanding between all the city agencies so that they all know what their respective role is. If it's not written down, oftentimes it gets very confusing, particularly in the heat of the moment. And it's important that you establish whose role is what in a critical incident. And then also develop a policy manual for TIM. This is a critical piece, and that's the TIM training. So there is actually some formalized training that's been developed by federal highways. It's been refined over the years by state departments of transportation and other cities and county jurisdictions. And what we recommend is that both SPD and SDOT train more people, not that nobody's been trained, but they have additional people that need to be trained. and also to name champions within each agency. And those are the people that would be the trainers in the future, and also be the ones to continue to move these projects forward to make sure that they focus on traffic incident management the way it needs to be done. And then conduct multi-agency actual tabletop exercises where you take incidents and you evaluate, okay, this happens here, how do we clear it? How do we clear it quickly? What kinds of things do we need to think about from various cities' perspectives? Leverage expertise from the state. So one of the things that our expert panel realized is that if you look at Washington State actually has a model program right now. They're considered one of the best in the country. And we've encouraged the City of Seattle, the DOT, and the SPD to actually leverage that expertise that already resides here in Washington State. Washington State also has a TIM network. It's made up of TIM trainers across the state from various county and city organizations and state patrols, state DOT, and that we believe that Seattle should join that TIM network and participate in that TIM training with those organizations. On-scene response and the Seattle Police Department. Obviously, Seattle Police Department is first on the scene, and so it's absolutely critical that their officers understand the new policies and practices, such as was mentioned, steer it and clear it, the hold harmless agreements, those kinds of things, that they have the ability to clear those scenes quickly, and that traffic clearance really needs to be one of their first priorities. Obviously, you need to worry about injuries and making sure that you're dealing with life and life safety issues first. Once those are covered, then it's a matter of clearing the road and dealing with the property damage and the vehicles later. The next thing is, go ahead, move on. The next thing is the Transportation Operations Center, which actually I think you're going to have an opportunity to tour at the end of this, is that there should be some additional mechanisms that could be put in place, gridlock alerts, other mechanisms that the Department of Transportation may have to communicate to the public and to news media and others on when there's a problem, ways to reroute traffic, those kinds of things. Also that Seattle DOT could work with SPD in getting access to their CAD logs, because the police dispatchers often have more real-time information from the officer on the scene about what's happening. Having that information in the Transportation Operations Center will help the DOT understand exactly what the situation is and how they can potentially reroute. And then modernize the Transportation Operations Center, because there's some technology and things like that that will help them better respond to these kinds of incidents. And most importantly is to have a presence of SPD in major events. One of the things that the team did note is that SPD is already doing that on a lot of major events. They'll send somebody over here as soon as they're notified so that they can immediately coordinate with the DOT. So that's already occurring. Towing contract and operations. As was mentioned in one of the findings said that the existing towing contract may be too restrictive. And so we recommend that there's a look at that towing contract. Even in light of that, to work more closely with the towing companies, make sure that the towing companies are involved in the exercises so that they know how they need to work together with the police department and the DOT. Commercial vehicle enforcement. Obviously, this event was caused by a very large truck. And there is a significant amount of very large commercial vehicles moving in and out of the city, primarily out of the port and through various parts of the city. And it only takes one incident like this one where a truck rolls over and it locks everything down. But it's an important aspect is to get to these trucks before they become a problem. And one of the things that we noted was that there needs to be a greater emphasis on commercial vehicle enforcement, both by the DOT and SPD. That currently the city ordinances are not robust enough to give them the tools that they need to actually have all the enforcement mechanisms against commercial motor vehicle operators, such as are at the state and federal level right now. And so we believe that we need to look at that and actually determine whether city ordinances need to be adopted to actually meet the same standards as the federal and the state regulations. And then also consider upgrades to technology such as weigh in motion and other things that will make it easier to enforce on commercial motor vehicles that aren't operating within the limits of the law. Data collection and evaluation. This is one where the TIM programs that are around the state and in other places of the country, they actually collect data. We believe that data collection is an important part for a couple of reasons. One, it gives us the ability to go back to the public and say, in the past, it took us 60 minutes to clear an incident, but today we can actually do it in 30 minutes. It actually helps show progress. It helps you measure yourself and your program, but it'll also help show you where you might have gaps in your program. And if you don't have the data, you have no ability to actually communicate that. It also is good for the public to understand where choke points are and what happens once an accident happens in those areas. Here's the average backup time. Here's the number of secondary collisions that happen, those kinds of things. So data is absolutely important to evaluating the program downstream and making improvements longer term. Next one. So the next steps, and this is my last slide, and then we'll open it up for questions. As was mentioned, I've been working with the city department since we actually have put together kind of an implementation plan on how to move forward. As I mentioned, they have already taken a number of actions already. What we're trying to do now is formalize the memorandum of understanding, the TIMS policies and practices across the agencies, and they're in the process of conducting training and identifying those individuals that need to be trained in TIMS, and then making some of those more lengthy recommendations. Those will come a little bit later as they move through some of these early stages. So I know that there is progress that's supposed to be to the mayor in January, but as I mentioned, there's already a lot of activity underway and other things that have already occurred that will really help improve traffic incident management here in Seattle. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are, as well as the chief and the director, are available for questions.
Mr. Mayor, one of the things we had, one of your predecessors established was incident response vehicles from the city that were available to respond. Will that be part of this plan?
So my understanding is those don't exist anymore. My understanding is, I believe it was back in the Nichols administration, they were funded and then cut from the budget.
Should we establish them now? What do you
I
think
would
about
have to defer to Chief Sandberg to tell us if that's one of her recommendations.
We recommended, that's one of the reasons why we recommended the data collection. It was my understanding that they determined previously that those vehicles weren't always used effectively. And so the reason for the data collection is to identify peak periods and maybe peak choke points. If they can identify a trend in those peak choke points and peak periods, then it would make more sense to only use those vehicles in those targeted times and targeted areas. Might be for special events only or those kinds of things, but until the data is collected, it's really hard to say you need to throw that kind of resource at it until you know what the problem is.
Chief Sandberg, if you would say for a second, one of the things that appear on the slide I didn't hear you talk about was the idea of some sort of free tow program. Would you expand on that and how would that work?
Yeah, that actually came from some of the experts that we brought in. There's a couple of cities that actually have recommended a free tow. And what that is again, during these peak periods or peak in specific choke points, is to have tow trucks that are available on contract to the city. And basically what those tow trucks would do is rather than wait for a tow to come from a long ways away or wait for the owner who said that they've called one but it might be an hour before they get there, is to go ahead and have tow trucks stationed at various places, move the vehicle to the next safe location, to a parking lot or whatever, and then at that point the owner can go get their own tow, but it moves the vehicle out of the roadway and allows the resumption of traffic flow at that point.
And what has to change about towing contracts to make it work better?
I haven't looked at this existing tow contract, but that's one of the things that we recommended that the city do, is to look at the existing tow contract and see if there's restrictions or problems that might create issues there. And I'll turn it over to Director Kugler.
So one of the things that we would want to look at with the existing tow contract that we had is where their vehicles are staged from. So given the hourglass shape of the city, the ability to get tow trucks responding quickly to the scene depends on traffic conditions and also where the crash is. So one of the things that we're going to look at with that tow contract is, do they have the facility to stage or the ability to stage and the facility to stage from other places or subcontract the tow companies that do?
Question for Ms. Sandberg about the steer clear rules. In Washington State and in the Seattle proposal that's coming up, is steer clear an optional thing that lets drivers do that without worrying about being accused of hit and run or leaving the scene, or is that a mandatory or is it mandatory just in the urban corridors? We see these signs next to washed-out freeways, but it's not entirely clear if that's mandatory or what.
Yeah, they try to make it mandatory. I mean, that's the objective of the sign. Obviously, there's some guidelines around that. One, if anybody's injured, you don't want to move the vehicle. And you want to be able to move the vehicle safely. So if you look at Washington DOT's website, they have a number of guidelines. They do press conferences on a regular basis. And that's one of the things we've actually recommended to the city is we believe that they have the ability to do steer it and clear it right now. And part of it is communication to the public on what steer it and clear it means, what the public's responsibility is, and why it's important that they clear it. They don't want to see 3 or 4 or 5 accidents behind them because they didn't get the vehicles out of the way and they had the ability to move them. So some of it's going to be a very big public education to the citizens in this area on what it means and what the citizens' responsibility is, where you move a vehicle. We always recommend that you at least exchange basic information before you move it in case you both move it to a different location and then you can't find each other, those kinds of things. So there's a lot of public information that has to occur around that.
So steer clear is already mandatory in Washington State,
The law is already in place in Washington State.
but not in Seattle.
Correct. That's what the report says it already exists in Washington State. You have a legal requirement to move the vehicle if you reasonably can do that.
Yeah.
And they recommend that we have a similar ordinance in Seattle, so
So-
that it's clear.
So we would
that-
need an ordinance.
Right.
So
So,
Mike-
and I've already been talking to the city attorney today about drafting the ordinance, and I'm going to get it through the council as soon as we can. Because if that will help to make it quite clear to people and our enforcement officers that people have to safely steer these out of the way, they can't sit there and bicker about who caused that, rear-end accident.
So if I get clipped from behind again on the West Seattle Bridge and we pull over and look, that's going to be a ticket from now on, and how much will it be?
Well, we can give you the text of the proposed ordinance if you want that.
Yes, we need an ordinance to enact the state.
Mr. Mayor, would you speak to the citizens' frustration? What are you hearing from them? And are you feeling the same thing about the idea that just one or two little things can set our town into rhythm?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when this happened, I'd been in office just over a year, the chief and Director Kugley just a few months. And we knew we went by the existing policy of the city that had been in place as a result of many council actions and many of my past predecessors. But it didn't work. And so we asked ourselves, what should we do? So we put together this report and we had the city examined. And it's clear that the existing policy of the city is inadequate. One of the great things about getting to be the new kids on the block for a little while is you get to look at existing policies without being defensive and say, hey, you know what, council? This doesn't work, and we're going to change it. And I think that's a good message to the folks of the city.
And
I'd
during
like-
this fish incident, would you express some of the frustration that both you and citizens are feeling? Because it can be a little accident anywhere that jams things up.
Well, so I think, first of all, we're not going to be able to change human nature. There will be accidents. And our ability to respond and to get traffic moving faster is what we can do better. And I think we held ourselves under a microscope. We saw what the city had not been doing for years. We have a path forward, and I think that will improve things significantly. When you reported on me when I chaired the Transportation Committee in the legislature, we were proactive in '05 in creating those truck responses that you mentioned that the city once had, that the state put in place. So I think we're reaching a moment to be proactive.
And Mayor, I think many people would agree that it doesn't take an accident these days to create gridlock in this city. What can you say to folks who live in our city about what seems like a growing traffic problem, and what is the city doing about that?
So, this is not a city problem. This is a region-wide problem. The city of Seattle is not a isolated bubble, with people just moving through the city by itself. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people come to Seattle every day in many different modes of transportation. We have, during rush hour, during peak hours, we have one of the highest penetration of transit users in and out of the downtown core. We're going to improve that. This city made a huge commitment at the ballot last year to increase transit. We're doing the largest increase in bus transit since Metro was created in the 1970s. We're ramping that up right now. We're putting on the ballot a pretty bold proposal to help, again, create corridors that will work more efficiently for people as well as cars, as well as for bicycles, as well as for buses. We were successful in getting ST3 passed in Olympia, and we're taking it to the ballot. We'll be opening up two new light rail stations in a few months. All of those things together are the answer. In a city like this, I can't speak for the rest of the region, but in a city like this, we don't have any place to build new roads and new streets. So our option is to make the system work more efficiently and to put as much transit as we can into the system.
I have a question for Councilmember.
Sure.
Hi, I have a question for Councilmember Rasmussen. You mentioned something I was actually meaning to follow up with you quite soon. The West Seattle Transportation Corridor
Yes.
Plan. You mentioned you're developing some recommendations for September, and
Yes.
so you have convened the task force that was
Yes,
discussed earlier this year.
what we call the interdepartmental team was convened last winter. I think it began working in February. It's representatives of various offices within the Department of Transportation and the Police Department to identify what can be done to improve the flow of traffic through that corridor. And mostly it's management issues, things like enforcement of prohibition of cars using the exclusive bus lanes and other strategic, rather low-cost but perhaps high-impact changes that can be made. It's quite a list, and I really appreciate the tremendous work that they've done. They're continuing to refine it. They're going to be working with the mayor's office. I met with the mayor's representative earlier this week to go over that list, and then it'll be finalized, and then we'll have a presentation in September on what is on that list. Some are what I call near-term, short-term improvements that can be made, such as enforcement. Others are long-term, until we get what the mayor is talking about, is light rail to West Seattle. Because what we need is grade-separated, exclusive travel by a mode of transportation such as light rail. So in the meantime, until we get light rail, which may be decades away, even if it's approved next year, you know how long it takes. We have to manage our system better, and that's what we're talking about now. And we'll get that list to you in September.
Let me add on to Councilmember Rasmussen's comment. I've asked staff to go through an exercise to look at, is there a way that we could, a proposal we could take to Sound Transit, where we could finance more light rail on a much faster track. It's very, very difficult given some of the financial models that Sound Transit works under, but we have to ask ourselves that question. Secondly, we're going to begin a process of asking, we know it will take some years before light rail is in West Seattle or in Ballard. Are there other things that we can do as interim steps? Are there other high-capacity, grade-separated, such as bus rapid transit, that we could create in key corridors of this city in conjunction with either Metro or Sound Transit between that time and the time that light rail stations open up? Don't know what the answers to those are, but we're going to do that exercise. Because to get to your question earlier, and the question from West Seattle, the city can't wait simply for light rail stations to open up in 2030.
So we want to take people through the Transportation Operations Center.
Okay, so follow these guys.